Charles Chesnutt and his Conjure Woman tales. Before I get into the biography of Chesnutt, I should just add a clarification. You have two stories from Chesnutt published in, I believe, 1887, 88, somewhere around there. Um, the Gooford Grapevine, that's how you say that, Gooford, and Poe Sandy. And those two stories, published in the 1880s, were later collected into a single volume called The Conjure Woman, with several other stories that he had produced about the same kind of general idea in 1899. So when I say Conjure Woman tales, that covers both of the stories that we have talked about, or that we will talk about, sorry, and other tales as well. Charles Chesnutt was born in Cleveland, Ohio in 1858 to free black parents. And in 1866, the family moved to Fayetteville, North Carolina, which was a move back home for his parents, who had fled from Ohio to Ohio before the war to avoid persecution. As a teen, he worked as a pupil and teacher at the Howard School, a local school for African Americans established by the Freedmen's Bureau during the period of Reconstruction. This was a paid arrangement the school's principal made with Charles's father in order to allow Charles to continue his schooling instead of having to work full-time at his parents' grocery store. Chesnutt became a teacher himself in Charlotte, North Carolina 2 years later, at the age of 16, returning within a few short years to Fayetteville's Howard School in 1877 as its assistant principal, and 3 years later its principal after the death of his mentor and former principal, Robert Harris. Chesnutt stayed at the Howard School until 1883, at which point, having studied Latin, German, French, mathematics, and stenography on his own, he set out for better paying work. He took up stenography in New York, but soon ended up in Ohio, where he worked as a stenographer for a railroad lawyer in whose office he also studied law. I should clarify that stenography is the practice of taking down a record of conversations, kind of shorthand court reporting kind of stuff. In 1887, Chesnutt passed the Ohio bar exam and reportedly at the head of his class, and by 1890 he had started a court reporting business that supported his family and his avocation for writing. He landed the Gooford Grapevine in the Atlantic Monthly in 1887 and followed that in 1888 with Poe Sandy in the same journal. He continued writing successful short fiction throughout the 1880s and the 1890s, and in 1899 published the highly successful collection of Uncle Julius tales called The Conjure Woman, and in the same year, The Wife of His Youth and Other Stories of the Color Line, a less successful but equally compelling collection of pieces, was also published, and those pieces are known for portraying complex racial subjectivities. Around this time, Chesnutt had also completed a couple novels, 1900's The House Behind the Cedars and The Marrow of Tradition, 1901. Chesnutt had great success with writing short fiction, and he believed that that success would parlay into success as a novelist and lecturer, but the public didn't really take to his novels. He had closed his court reporting business in 1900 because he thought he was going to do well with writing, but he had to reopen it in 1902. He published one final novel, 1905's The Colonel's Dream, but it was even less successful than his prior two. In the end, Chesnutt was to sum up his own fading literary fortunes in the title of an essay he published in 1932 reflecting on his own career, he was, quote, post-bellum, pre-Harlem. So that means after the war, post-bellum, pre-Harlem as in pre-Harlem Renaissance, when many African American writers experienced a great deal of success with writing about African American life. So Chesnutt represents this kind of in-between figure, but recently critics have really begun paying attention to his, as in the past 20 years, his entire set of works. So now for some thoughts on Poe Sandy and the Gooford Grapevine. And there's so much to do with these texts. I think primarily we ought to be thinking about these as a response to Joel Chandler Harris and Thomas Nelson Page in particular, and in general the plantation tradition in fiction. Uncle Julius gives us a character who is not like Uncle Remus. Uncle Remus sort of exists to be a storyteller for the white audience. You know, there's not much going on with him. I don't see any sort of subversive intent. Uncle Julius, however, is involved in a complex position. He needs to, you know, continue to be able to have access to the place that that he grew up in, and to be able to succeed there. And yet he's at the mercy of, you know, the economic situation, and particularly because he doesn't own that plantation. It is now owned by this northern couple who comes down. So Uncle Julius is actually playing a sort of wily game there when he's telling them stories. He wants something out of it other than just to entertain them. And not just sort of, you know, he needs to continue to be around the plantation. He's able to secure a kind of job with John and Annie. But he's also wanting to show them something about what slavery really was like. So think of that in relation to what's going on in Marge Chan, especially. Marge Chan is celebrating a past that it wants to paint as a kind of golden age. Uncle Julius wants to give you a tale that tells you something about what the situation, or sorry, what the system of slavery actually was about. Also think about the narration here. The narrator is John, so he's this northern guy who apparently has money and a little bit of free time on his hands, decides that he's going to move he and his wife south, ostensibly for her health, but also because, you know, he wants to invest in grape culture. And then you have Annie, who we hear from as well, and then you have Julius. So there are three different people to keep, to keep thinking about as you read these stories. I think it's well worth your time to think about the difference between John and Annie. How does Annie hear these tales as opposed to John? And especially in Poe Sandy, think about the last bit of Poe Sandy where, you know, Annie says something like, how horrible the tales were. And John thinks that she's talking about, you know, that she actually believes a person could be turned into a tree. And then she says, no, not that, but something else. So she's thinking about especially sympathizing with the female character Tenny in that last story. So again, just to wrap up quickly, think about this as a reply to the plantation tradition, and think about the narrator, and think about the narrator's wife and what's going on in those stories.